I can't tell you how delighted I am to be back in Colorado, especially on the West Slope. I always like to come and visit our water before it finds its way down to Lake Mead. Said hello to it on the way. And yes, it's been over a year now. I've been incredibly fortunate to have been able to have stayed in the realm of water and have had lots of opportunities to travel around the country. And I wanted to share something with you on a positive note before we get into the challenges that we all face collectively here in the next short term. I also sit on the World Economic Forum, on the Global Agenda Council for Water. And it came as somewhat of a surprise to me but a very pleasant surprise, how intrigued the world is with the work that has been accomplished by this Colorado River community over the last 20 years. If you look back 20 years, there's been an amazing transformation that's happened. And despite all the bickering, despite all the acrimony, despite all the finger pointing, some amazing work has been accomplished. And it's been accomplished by, in large measure, you. There are individuals throughout the world that now travel here to find out how we did it. I've hosted delegations from Turkey, from Pakistan, from the Far East, all with river systems with similar challenges, multi-jurisdictional, international boundaries that say, how did you do it? How did you get the kind of agreements that were forged? And the reason I'm starting with that this morning is we need to look at the successes in order to keep the challenges that we face in perspective and not perceive them as insurmountable. The question here during this conference is, does California matter? And probably sitting up here in Colorado, you sometimes question whether California matters. Yes, you know there's the compact. Yes, you know there's the delivery obligation, but those are obtuse. They're written on a piece of paper. Lawyers love to pound the table and hold up all the must-dos and can't-dos. But at the end of the day, there are two major reasons why California matters. One, the Colorado River and the Sacramento-San Joaquin Bay Delta are inextricably connected. And number two, the story of California is the story of missed opportunities and of the inability, the human inability, to find solutions. Let's start with the interconnections. Those of you who have heard me speak before, and I don't think it's a story that can be told enough. I've sometimes mused that it probably is time to run a general public education campaign throughout the Colorado River Basin, getting people to understand they're citizens of a basin. Yes, they're citizens of the United States. Yes, they're citizens of their state. Yes, they're citizens of their community, but they are also citizens of a basin. And it's not a natural basin. It's an artificial basin. I don't need to tell you about trans-mountain diversions. You've lived it. Wyoming moves it out of the basin. Utah moves it across the Utah desert to the Front Range, to Salt Lake, Provo, Orem, agricultural communities, not in the basin, natural basin. New Mexico connects it with the Rio by moving it down to Albuquerque. Arizona moves it across the Arizona desert to the central cities. And we all know California takes it from Havasu in the other direction to the coastal cities in California. It even gets to Tijuana through a diversion off the All-American Canal. What happened last year? What happened last year clearly illustrates why we're connected to the Bay Delta. Met was getting virtually nothing. The Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, 20 million customers, 20 million people reliant on the water that they bring in, could not get water sufficient in any measure to meet the demands in Southern California, and no amount of conservation was going to completely replace that supply. They had been wise, and in the preceding years had entered into fallowing arrangements with Palo Verde, where they had temporarily taken some ag out. Metropolitan had stored it behind Hoover Dam in Lake Mead. And so with no water being available from the north, guess what they did? The only thing they could have done, they took reserves out of Lake Mead. So a reservoir that was experiencing some of the worst decline in a given year anyway, due to hydrology, was going to be driven down even further, and was driven down even further because Metropolitan had no choice. If it's dry in the Sacramento, it's going to affect the Colorado. So to sit and think that we can ignore it, I've been asked over the last several months, what is the biggest issue, one of the biggest issues facing the Colorado River? The Sacramento-San Joaquin Bay Delta. That problem has to be fixed. It makes the Colorado virtually unmanageable if you take a large urban area like Metropolitan and push them in a corner with no way out, with no water to be able to provide. That's why I'm praying that Klaus is right, that water does find its way to California this year, that we do see somewhat of a relief. And unfortunately, we're all going to shrug our shoulders then and say, okay, good, we survived again. Well, we should know better. 2011 was great. 2012, 2013 were miserable. That's the kind of variation we're going to be living with. So if we're all interconnected, those are not only challenges, they also represent opportunities. And I'll get back to that. The second reason why California is important is if we don't open our eyes and write that next success chapter in the story of the Colorado River, the California story will be the Colorado River story. That is the story of missed opportunities for decades, back to the days of Bruce Babbitt. That state and its various user groups and its various stakeholders have been arguing about what to do about the Sacramento-San Joaquin system. It's got diversions to the Central Valley. It's got diversions down to Metropolitan. It is a major water supply for the entire state. Those decades of arguing, those decades of going to court is a lovely strategy if you want to stop something. It doesn't do much to solve the problems. And having stopped everything along the way, the net result are the consequences of the drought this year. There were any number of wet years that went by where water could have been stored that weren't. There were any number of opportunities to build flexibilities into the system that weren't. And no one group is more guilty than the other group. I had to feel bad for the California farmers this year. They just can't seem to catch a public relations break. They had been told and told and told, get out of those low-value crops of alfalfa and get out of those crops that aren't producing a lot of revenue and go into more high-value crops. So they did. And who became the #1 culprit real quickly? Almonds. Well, over 90% of the world's almond supply now comes from California. One district in the Colorado River down at the Imperial is 11% of this country's fresh winter fruits and vegetables. Ag is not the bad guy in this. The cities aren't the bad guy in this. And yes, not even the environmental community are the bad guy. But none of them are listening and trying to find a solution. It is very easy to stand there and recite your cause over and over and over and over again. But it is not easy to try to find a new balance point. It is not easy to try to understand your adversary's position or your fellow stakeholders' position. And that was the challenge that was left unmet in California. Everyone's been tinkering in it as if it was a giant laboratory. No one area in that fragile balance of environment, ag, urban is going to come out on top. And this year proved it, and last year proved it. Who lost? Everyone lost. Jennifer told me yesterday the fish are in dire straits in the Delta. The cities are hurting. There are areas in the rural communities where unemployment is unbelievable. I was in California just about a month ago, and I was stunned. I have never seen so many ads for food banks on the California television stations ever going in. They were constant pleas to the food banks to send food to the food banks so they can be sent into those rural communities with huge unemployment numbers where people can't work because there aren't any fields to work in. Our success stories here on the Colorado River, in large measure, were because we understood our system a lot better. And we got over some real tough differences. Upper basin, lower basin. Within the lower basin, we all forgot, we all forget very quickly what that compact really says. That compact says prior appropriations make no sense between states in this river system. Just because you grow faster doesn't mean you get to have all the water. That's why we have a compact. So California, and again, California was the culprit, that was growing so fast, didn't take all the water in the river. We said we are 7 equal partners. 7 equal partners with their constituencies, their economies, their cultures, their heritage, and we will share this system on an equitable basis. Since that compact was signed, particularly in the lower basin, everyone ran to court to try to carve out some special niche for themselves, some special little hook that gave them an advantage. We're sitting at a critical point this year. We have an opportunity to fix many of the ills that we will be facing, that the climate will be doling out to us. We can create mechanisms that will allow us to protect the system. We all depend on the system, and we all have to conserve, and we all have to participate in the management of the system. If the Colorado River crashes, everyone is affected. I have been very blunt with my friends in California lately who hold up their piece of paper and say they have the senior right on the river. And I say, great. Sure hope it can leave Lake Mead and find its way down there. Mead drops below 900 and nothing goes south. And that piece of paper will be as useless a piece of paper as you could possibly have. Ask the Central Valley farmers. They'll tell you of what little use that priority water right was. Now, had they all been willing over the years to manage the system better, perhaps leave some water in Shasta, perhaps one year grow 2–3% less crops and keep Shasta above a certain elevation, maybe they wouldn't have fallen as deeply as they fell. If we protect Lake Powell and we protect the power head there that we all depend on, if we protect Lake Mead and protect the water supply that fuels 3 states and the country of Mexico, maybe we can get through. If we take a little less, if the cities find ways of using less water, if conservation isn't the enemy, but conservation is one of the best tools we have to afford us an opportunity to avoid disaster. Lake Mead was 10 feet higher than it would have been because Mexico left water behind Hoover Dam, because they deliberately fallowed fields and left the water behind, as did California. They saw the benefit of that because they had it to fall back on when they needed it. This next generation of collaboration on this system says, let's not save it for ourselves, let's save the system. If we each take a little bit less in times when we can, and we can manage taking that little bit less, and we set limits on how far we're comfortable letting the system drop before we start actively recharging the system, then we won't be sitting in front of dry reservoirs. People forget Lake Mead's a V. Yes, it took us a long time to get from 1220 down to the 1080s where we are now. But we're getting down in the lower reaches of that V. That decline is going to happen much faster in the lower basin. And as it starts ratcheting down, we get increasingly close to elevation 900. And then what? Then there is nothing going into Mojave, there's nothing going into Havasu, there's nothing going into Imperial, and there's nothing going into Mexico. Then panic sets out. And I have been one of the biggest opponents of making the call, as we love to call it. But what do panicked people do? They react irrationally. And that kind of irrational behavior is what you can expect. We will have all-out chaos. That's why the efforts are there today, to prevent that from happening. People have criticized Governor Brown for being as aggressive as he's been on the conservation measures in California. He has no arrows in his quiver. He doesn't have a lot of tools to work with at this point. All those missed opportunities over the decades, all those inabilities to find common solutions, take common risks, find common balance points. Those were all missed, and you can't bring them back. You can't. I hear that Congress wants to fund reuse facilities now. Well, they're certainly not going to help right now. It's a little late for that. The latest story was in our newspaper day before yesterday, which was now the sewer systems are plugging up in California because guess what? People went to indoor conservation first because it's the easiest for them to do. They didn't go to the outside. They went inside. And so now there's not enough flow in the sewer systems. We all know better. All of us in this room, we're professionals. We know what the consequences of too much of a good thing is. So finding a balance point. If there is any river community that can do it, it's this one. But we better hold California up as an example of where we don't want to go. If you don't think that if Meade hits 900, this system will be federalized, you're fooling yourself. I can't tell you how many people have said to me, maybe we should do to the Colorado River what the Australians did to the Murray-Darling. And I go, whoa, slow down. What has prevented that has been our ability to find compromise. It is the lower basin's responsibility to care what happens in the upper basin. There are opportunities for us to help balance out this system. We have always spoken about water as a right. This is the century where water is a responsibility. And we can carve the pathway to make it happen. If it doesn't, we have no one to blame but ourselves. We know what tools we need to bring to the table. At some point, we need to start talking about augmenting the system, and it's not a silver bullet. It'll be a mosaic made up of many pieces. But this river community cannot afford to live the California story. So far, we have done the opposite. So far, this community has succeeded where no one thought we could succeed. But this next round of what's required is going to make us really have to dig deep. I've used this quote over and over and over again, and I'm going to close on it. It's one of my favorite quotes. Change is coming. You have two choices. You can be an architect of that change, or you can be its tenant. I think Klaus pointed out very clearly the changes, the uncertainties, the fluctuations, the huge pendulum swings climatically that we're going to be experiencing. Those days of certainty are over. Who is the better builder of the solution? We, who live by this river? We, who depend on this river? Or someone 3,000 miles away who sees it in the abstract? That question isn't hypothetical. That question is real. And I can't imagine the chaos that would happen if the Colorado River became the California story. Thank you.
Any questions for Pat? And we do have a microphone here, so if they'll chase around there. We have one over here, Commissioner Richards.
Well, thank you so much for being here today and your very forward-thinking comments. As you know, Colorado is finishing up its water plan. Final comments due next week on the 17th. And within the Front Range basins, we see a different dynamic than on the west slope. The Colorado River Basin has chosen the moderate to high conservation values going forward, but most of the Front Range communities have chosen low to moderate. And their concern has been that without well-watered lawns, kind of traditional growth patterns of the East Coast, that people won't buy their real estate and it'll end their boom. And they're really very resistant to putting in those sort of more strenuous conservation values, conservation programs for the future growth of the doubling of our population. Do you have any advice on items like that?
You know, we faced that in Southern Nevada, and probably more profoundly even than the Denver area, or any of the Front Range communities. And it took some acclimating by people to begin to see beauty. I mean, the description of desert landscaping in Las Vegas in the early 90s was rock, a cactus, and a dead cow skull. That's how people viewed conservation. We invested heavily we now have a 6-acre desert demonstration garden, and we give awards for desert landscaping. Find creative landscape architects that can make it beautiful. Make it beautiful, and you can leave your lawnmower behind. It is a real cultural shift. But people need to understand that there's a need to conserve. Now, I know all of you knew him. Chips Berry was one of my dearest friends in the whole world. And Chips and I had this conversation many, many, many times. What Chips would always tell me is, Pat, it's our drought bank. We can brown those lawns out when we have a drought. It's our reserve. There's a fear that if you let the water go, then it will be used for growth. And someone else will take it, right? And then you have no drought buffer. So planning for the drought and where you're going to take reserves from when that happens is a whole another piece of this conversation. We went into groundwater banking. We went into banking in Arizona. We bank now in Lake Mead. We just put it in places, and it's not part of available supply, if you will. So, was there another? Yes.
Pat, you talked about augmentation and then going to look at mosaic. We've heard of augmentation from the basis that it can be becoming icebergs, although that's kind of laughed at. But there's folks in this room who would say the Missouri River is the surefire thing to do. But in your mind, what does that mosaic look like?
I think that mosaic looks like reuse in areas where they currently send the wastewater out to the ocean or put it in evaporation ponds. With the word of caution that you be very careful what you use reuse for. I think there are great opportunities for industrial use of reuse, outside landscaping for reuse. People are now talking about direct potable reuse. What we don't know is what worries me sometimes more than what we know on that one, although I know technology can clean water to any extent. I think we need to rethink our attitude toward ocean desalting. I don't think we can build large ocean desalters because, quite honestly, we don't have the power supply for it. I mean, on the river for a while, we were looking at building a big desalter on the Sonoran side at Rocky Point. But a big million-acre-foot desalter would require a nuclear power plant. Then Fukushima happened. And as fracture-riddled and earthquake-prone as that zone is, putting a nuclear power plant down there makes little of any sense. So that one got scrapped. But for communities, the problem I have with desalt is we tend to want to just use it as an emergency supply rather than use it as a baseload supply and then allow for environmental uses of the fresh water that comes in and use it to store. So there's a balance there. I think that groundwater banking during wet years is absolutely essential. And then on a larger national scale, and I know people cringe when they hear this, but I think maybe we need to start thinking about it. Hoover Dam was built as a flood control project, not as a water supply or power supply project. That is its primary goal, is flood control. I think as the climate in the midsection of the country gets wetter and wetter, one man's flood control project is another man's water supply. Can it be used to recharge the Ogallala? Can we remanage the flood system on the larger Mississippi stem to recharge overdrafted groundwater basins, to move water to reservoirs during those flood events? I think we need to start thinking really creatively. Our populations have grown to a point, our economies have grown to a point, the global population is increasingly dependent on U.S. food product, that we have to get creative. And this is not a time to throw any idea off the table. All ideas have to be in. And let's look at the details and see where and how and if they can work. But a little bit of everything and a little bit of remanaging systems where we take better advantage of wet years in order to get through drier periods, I think if the time has ever come, that time is now.
One quick follow-up. Where does that discussion take place?
Certainly not in Congress. I think that discussion takes place in the larger water community. I really do.
I have a comment. I really enjoyed the talk. You said something about certainty, that times of certainty are over. They never were there.
Well, listen, we thought they were. We had engineered our way out of it.
And I'm telling you they weren't.
Oh, I believe you.
I think the issue was that we have the two things that are sort of very predictable. Number one, population growth. Number two, temperature warming.
Yes.
Those two occur for how much water we have. And the last little thing here, the central part of the country, the region that has been getting wetter is the upper Midwest, north of the East Coast. Once you get south of Nebraska, we haven't had a wetting trend.
Right, but when you get north of
You
it,
have to go very far.
right. Thank you.